Okay, so today's topic is college writing. The main thing that we're going to do is go through the objectives of two required courses at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, where the three of us teach. And as I say that, I also know that for me at least, the phrase college writing is problematic. We can spend a lot of time talking about what that is. We'll get into that phrase later. And then I think the really practical thing that might interest people, we're going to try to sort of discuss if we agree, the different ways we think these objectives, what they mean. And then we're going to try to say practically, like, what kind of assignments do we do and what do we find ourselves talking about to the students? So that's the plan for today. So I'm joined by, we have what are called course coordinators at App State. We have a expository writing 1000 course. And Ben Good is the coordinator for RC 1000 expository writing classes. Ben, can you just say a little bit about like what that work involves?
Sure. So most importantly, I think I'm kind of a consultant for new faculty who are teaching RC 1000. I do a lot of work with orientation and with supporting those new folks. I lead some professional development stuff throughout the semester as well, and usually try to encourage the RC 1000 faculty to compile some of their assignments and work, and also to reflect a little bit on the work that they're doing in their RC 1000 courses.
So I'm tempted to say, because college writing is a problematic phrase, I'm tempted to say college writing according to Ben, Kelly, and Bill. But I want to point out that as course coordinators, the two of you are involved in training new faculty, and you have a much broader sense of what's happening in a lot of the course sections than say someone like me would have. So as you two are talking about college writing, what happens in these courses, you are a little bit more qualified, a lot more qualified than me, maybe, or at least you know those other sections. So I wanted to point that out about your job. Kelly, so you're 2001. What would you sort of add to what Ben has said?
I think Ben did a really good job of sort of summing up what we do as course coordinators. I would say for me, I'm in a little bit different position because in addition to teaching in the Rhetoric and Composition Program, I also work with the Writing Across the Curriculum program. So being the course coordinator for RC 2001, which is Introduction to Writing Across the Curriculum, I wear a few different hats as the course coordinator.
I'm glad that I failed to say the name when I talked about 2001. So when we get into those objectives, our course is called, and this is the one I most frequently teach, it's called Writing Across the Curriculum. We also have a Writing Across the Curriculum office. Unless I spend some time on that, my students are oblivious to what the name of the course is, and that there's an office on campus doing work all across campus, with that name. So, okay. So we're going to, I want to give you a chance to react to this. Both of you sort of nodded when I said it. What would you say so I want to read a statement to you and you can react to it. College writing as a way of writing in college and defined by most professors in similar ways is a myth. Is that something that you agree with? You kind of agree with, either one of you want to tackle that?
Kelly, why don't you go first?
I would say it's 100% a myth, just because as a WAC consultant, we speak with faculty from across campus all the time, and they all have a different definition of what good college writing is in their class. And this is one of the reasons that RC 2001 is so important. But yeah, it really depends upon who you ask, and you can ask people within the RC program and they'll have slightly different definitions. So yeah, I would say 100% it's a myth.
All right, Ben.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it seems like many professors across campus have their own varying understandings of what college writing is, and also our students come into the course with completely false expectations about what their college writing course is going to be like and what we will value as their professors as well.
Nice. So we sound on the same page. I mean, I think I would say, I know I have two high school students both of whom are often told they're being prepared for what's happening in college. And they both have a sense of what kind of work I do in my classes, and so I think they're skeptical about that as well. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, and then to argue with myself, we do have a list of objectives of things that have to do with college writing that we are following and working on. So in some senses, if we were to say our objectives are college writing, maybe. And of course, that would depend on each professor's interpretation of the objectives, if they're willing to even read and think about them. And then as you go from institution to institution, what are their objectives? They might be very different than ours.
Right. I try at least to sort of demystify a little that for my students, especially because I'm focusing on freshman writers, and I talk with them about how it is very likely that they will have professors who will approach writing and evaluate writing in different ways than I do. And so I try to prepare them for those inevitabilities. And the last thing I want them to do is to think that there's just one standard for what college writing is or what it should look like.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ben. It's, it all depends. And I want them to have that situational awareness when they leave my classroom, to be able to determine what needs to be done.
And we may be able to come back and probably directly link what each of you have just said to one of our objectives. Like, one of the goals coming out of the class is that they have that kind of awareness. The awareness that it'll vary widely. Okay, so we have 4 goals for 1000. I have taught 1000 at App State before, not currently teaching it. I'm going to read, and then there's a couple bullets that kind of explain underneath. I'm just going to read the top objective and the top goal, and we might go down into some of those bullets. So RC 1000 students must exhibit increasing rhetorical knowledge. So rhetorical knowledge can certainly mean many things to many people. Maybe in 1000 we'll let Ben always take the first shot, unless you don't want to do that, and then we'll see if Kelly and I have anything to add. So rhetorical knowledge, how do you take that phrase, Ben?
Oh wow. Well, I guess I focus on that phrase, increasing rhetorical knowledge. I try to provide my students with some framework and foundational terminology in rhetoric, and then understand how they might use that framework to you reach certain audiences and achieve certain purposes, and also then to sort of deconstruct how another writer or speaker or communicator might be utilizing rhetoric as well.
Kelly, rhetorical knowledge, or would you maybe not even is that not something you gravitate to as much there?
I would say that kind of goes back to what I just said. Like, it all depends. Like, I want them to have that situational awareness, have purpose, audience, so I think that pretty well sums up my my approach to the RC 1000 sort of concept of rhetorical knowledge.
A couple of things I think I would add would be, I certainly have seen a lot of high school teachers, and you guys may do this as well. And I know we have colleagues who spend quite a bit of time on something like ethos, logos, and pathos, which I don't really see in these objectives. I don't see anything saying don't do that. And then I also want to contextualize our objectives. To me, are very tightly tied. Our professional organization, 4 C's, their position statement about teaching of writing also, mentions the rhetorical nature of knowledge without saying anything about ethos, logos, and pathos. So I think that is sometimes part of the myth of college writing, is that's what we're doing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. And then I'm going to turn it into my classroom a little bit, and then come back to you guys on maybe some assignments or class activities related to this. To me, I really grab onto audience and purpose. So I think about writing that's for no one, where the students have done a lot of writing and turned it in to someone probably who had too many students to really read it very carefully. And what they've experienced is people marking things wrong on their papers. And so I really try to set up a community, and I try to detrain the students from finding errors. So what they're used to doing is sitting in a circle and picking out the 6 things that are wrong and giving you 3 suggestions. that probably aren't suggestions I really support. So I'm trying to like detrain them of that and just like, here are human beings interested in you and your ideas, and they're paying attention to you. And the fact that you have a real audience that you're trying to communicate with, something in your head, something in their head, for you to experience that, that's going to help you as a writer. And so those are the ways that I try to like bring that to life in my class. How would you, what are like some specific assignments that you give or something that you do in class when it comes to that phrase rhetorical knowledge?
Yeah, what you were just saying, Bill, made me think. I also, I think that the students who do come in with some background understanding of rhetoric do come in with that very formulaic understanding that you were describing of the rhetorical appeals. And one point that I try to emphasize is that rhetoric is functioning sort of in all the situations that we find ourselves in. I think many people think of rhetoric as only functioning as like when a politician is giving a speech or, some sort of very explicit example like that. And I always talk about how, if you're trying to convince your roommate to order Pizza Hut, or if you're explaining to your mom what happened over the weekend or whatever it is, all those kind of casual communications have that going on. I do agree with your point about purpose and audience. I try to create some assignments where students are writing for a very specific audience other than just a professor grading the paper. So I theme my RC 1000 courses on the topic of conspiracy theories. And so I have my students write to a conspiracy theorist in order to try to sort of work through how they would communicate with that kind of audience in a productive way, and how they might reach through that kind of maybe barrier and appeal to that kind of audience.
Kelly?
I would say, in terms of purpose and audience, I automatically think about the narrative that my RC 1000 students do, and how we have a discussion about number one, when their audience is their peers, their classmates, they're sharing their story with their classmates, and how the language that they use in that narrative is going to be different as they tell their story. They can use their, if they have a different home language, if they would like, they can use, colloquial terms. They can use I, because they've all been told that you never, ever, ever use I. In college, you have to get rid of that. And we talk about like why it's appropriate to not write a narrative in third person, because that would be really creepy. We have that conversation about sort of like, okay, this is your audience, this is the purpose for, this essay, and this is why you're going to use language differently here than you will in the next research project, for example. And so they sort of understand like, oh, okay, well, in this situation, I'll make these rhetorical choices. In the next rhetorical situation that I'm put in, I'm going to make these, choices.
I like Ben's mention of Pizza Hut. Because to me, one of the first jobs I have is to convince everyone in the room who has to take this class, who would never take this class if they didn't have to, that what we're doing is super relevant and useful to their lives. So I know that audience and purpose are things I am considering, 20 times a day for all kinds of reasons, which, maybe even would involve, for example, making a phone call to an IRS agent to explain why this notice I got, or the DMV. I can remember something that came up with my wife in the last week or two, like, you guys have made a mess of this. And I have to talk to, she had to talk to the DMV in a logical way that would help them want to help her instead of be angry at her. So I find myself using this, this stuff all the time. One thing I want to pick out, I think, is a little problematic, although, something that grabs my attention is one of our sub points under that first goal says writing with strong voice and authority. So one thing I would say in this 2000 class, I have a football player who played football in South Florida. So he can write with authority about playing in the heat. I mean, he can write with authority on that. But if I'm asking him to venture into discipline specific academic journals, it's impossible to ask him to write with authority. I'm trying to stretch him into this space of his major or whatever. And so just like, for me, I find myself not expecting authority given some circumstances. That's just something I don't know if that's, I'm picking at something there or.
No, I agree, Bill. It's especially in 1000, if they're writing a narrative, yes, they can speak with authority because it's their story. But then when they get into, other assignments, they don't feel like they have that authority. And we kind of, and I always tell students, even in RC 2001, you're sort of dipping your toe into your discourse community. You're not jumping in with both feet quite yet. So in terms of feeling that they have authority, and they have the ability to full on join the conversation, is difficult.
Yeah, I agree with both of y'all. I think it's a fair point. I talk openly with my students about imposter syndrome. I think that another case where students struggle with this lack of sense of authority is when they're maybe doing peer review for the first time, and they think, who am I to be offering feedback or advice? And that's a conversation, that is important, I think, for us to have in these kinds of courses, because they don't get to really have those in other courses, many of which still do incorporate some levels of peer review across the curriculum.
Yeah, so a recent thing that we've done, and I think it's a pretty common assignment in the 2001 class, is there's a genre of news story about research projects. So it's a 35-page article about the impact of people who use TikTok over 5 hours a day. So let's say that's the article. And their job is to write. And then, so if you go to the New York Times, if you go to NPR, there are tons of 500-word stories. New study suggests TikTok, whatever. So we're working on that assignment. We're doing that as a stretch into academic journals. It's the main reason that we're doing it, is like, you have to dig in on this academic journal, figure out what it says, and say it back to us in a concise, interesting way, taking out all that academic jargon, which is a very, a really challenging assignment. And so I was sitting in on these workshops this week, struck by the really terrible advice that everyone was giving everyone, which often involved, like, you should get into this, or you should talk about so one of the stories was about using satellite technology to have more productive farms. And so all the advice there was advice like, you should get into how this impacts farmers economically who can't afford this technology. But that's not what the research study is, right? So everybody's asking for like elaboration and more and an argument. So the trick, I think, so on the one hand, Ben, it sounds like I'm saying something different than you, which is like, guys, that's not helpful advice, which I didn't say. But I'm trying to train them with like, what kinds of things can you say? Which is like, I found this part really interesting, or a question about your work. So that I find a challenge. And if we're doing something like a workshop in class, that is challenging. And then you guys are like, okay, Torg, thanks. No, that's good. Go ahead, Kelly. Yeah, we don't.
But I think that's a really important part of the peer review process, is that we jump in and say like, yeah, that was really great advice, or like, okay, well, I totally see your point and I see why you, however, if you, and sort of like to get them back on track, because they're practicing giving advice, they're practicing doing peer review. So I think that's an important part of it, is for us to be able to kind of shape that feedback, so that the peers learn as well. Like, it's not all about the author and peer review, it's about the people giving their reviews as well.
And I think it's something that we all navigate in our field and in life. We have to sort through conflicting advice and decide what we want to do. Yeah. All right. So this is going to be a 5-hour podcast if we keep this pace. So I don't think that means speed up. I think this is interesting. But we'll see if we make it through all these objectives. Okay. So goal number 2, and I'm even going to get into some of the bullets, because I think the goal number 2 is pretty non-specific, perhaps. All right. RC 1000 students must exhibit increasingly critical thinking, reading, and writing skills. And so some things that are mentioned are using writing and reading for learning, thinking, and communicating, demonstrating critical thinking in part by understanding that personal investments and cultural perspectives are woven into language and knowledge, and locating, evaluating, analyzing, synthesizing, and documenting primary and secondary sources. So as you look at all that, what are some things that you dig in on, you think, in your classes, Ben?
I dig in on that cultural perspectives woven into language and knowledge. That's one that jumps out at me. I love to discuss definition claims in my RC 1000 course. So we discuss how do we define the term conspiracy theory, for instance, or where does the definition of the word marriage come from, or whatever it may be. And then that usually opens up into a pretty provocative discussion. And we talk about how definitions kind of function as collectively agreed upon or debated ways of constructing our reality. And both of those examples, those terms also exemplify, I think, how those definitions can have real world implications for people and for our society.
Kelly?
I kind of, with this one, I'm thinking about the locating, evaluating, and analyzing, synthesizing information, and I'm thinking about research. And also in terms of reading, my RC 1000 students are doing research this week, and I find it more and more difficult every semester to sort of explain to students how to even navigate a computer screen, sort of like what they're looking at, and how to navigate that space. Like, even, for example, if they're locating an academic article, or even just an article on a website, they have trouble looking at the screen and saying, okay, what journal is this from? What website is this from? Who are the authors? What is this organization about? And so, just because I've noticed that students sort of look at the title of whatever they find and go with it, because it has a cool title and maybe it's sketchy, that I'm sort of asking them to look at the minutia of the whole screen and what's around them, because we don't have these tangible books anymore to say, largely anyway, to say like, oh, this is where it comes from. And they've been skipping over that whole part. So I really have been honing in on that, like, before we get to the content of what they're looking at, sort of like how they navigate that space and how they read it before we get to the content, to put everything into context for them.
You guys made me think of a lot there. So Ben, you use that word culture, and we can side note Kelly, big role in putting together the textbook, which doesn't mean that she chose this text that I'm getting ready to bring up. So there's a text in our digital textbook called "Should Writers Use Their Own English?" Mm-hmm. And so, just to read the first sentence, cultural critic Stanley Fish come talking about in his 3-piece New York Times, "What should colleges teach suit? They're only one way to speak and write and get ahead in the world. What writing teachers should clear their mind of the orthodoxies that have taken hold of the composition world." So that's the kind of writing that often, as a high school and middle school public school teacher, that I was getting hammered by English department heads and principals who, to various degrees, accepted my argument that what they were saying was wrong about working with student writers. If sentences that resembled that appeared in final portfolios, then there's a big problem with the work that I was doing in my class. So that's like when Ben, that's a way that I sort of latch onto this cultural perspective phrase in my class, is just to talk about our right to our own language and maybe how to pass the class but still resist thoughtfully, or maybe not resist thoughtfully, or that's some choices that they have. And then kind of going over to what Kelly said, first, I'm fairly heavy on just the App State databases. And I would go 85% of my students are pretty illiterate in how that works. Mm-hmm. Being very experienced with keywords, what Kelly said of just like looking at that and knowing who wrote it and what journal it appeared in and what date. and then a little bit more complex about or like not forgetting to click that scholarly review, and that if you don't click it, what comes up isn't wrong or bad, it's just different. And so they really think in terms of like good sources and bad sources, even though a tweet might be the perfect source depending on what you're writing about. So we get into that kind of stuff. And then this was amazing to me, we did a genre, we're talking about genre as being a text that does work for a discourse, such as math majors or App State football fans, et cetera, all those being groups that okay. So we analyze different social media posts, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and it was shocking just that they would have like a Facebook post and they couldn't identify who posted it. And in this case, it was a Snapchat of, I forget Marty's last name from ESPN when he jumps in the duck pond. So, Barstool App State, I think, steals the Snapchat video, which gets retweeted. So and then what the motives of those people would be, because motives are like, they want to share with us about App State, or they want to increase the brand of App State. It's like, no, these people want to make money, right? And they want to garner followers. So investigating those, I thought they would be a little bit more, I was worried what I was going to point out was too obvious, but it turned out to be like revelations for them in class as we sort of dissected the ownership of these social media posts.
Yes, I had the same experience with a little bit a different assignment. It was for my RC 2001 students, but I asked them to do an assignment similar to what you were talking about, Tor. They take a scholarly article and they translate it, so to speak, for a popular audience. But I get them to choose specifically a popular audience, like, okay, write for BuzzFeed, write for NPR, whatever. And a handful of students, I think it was last semester or the semester before, came up to me and said, well, what sort of popular, sites do you suggest? And I was like, well, what do you read? And they were like, just social media, Instagram, Snapchat. And I was like, where do you get your news? And they were like, yeah, from social media. And I said, well, where do those articles come from? And they were like, we really don't pay attention to where it comes from. I was like, okay, let's back up. So kind of like you, I thought it was going to be sort of obvious, and to some students, maybe it was. But that's why I decided to kind of backtrack and break things down even more.
Yeah, it's interesting that both of y'all I'm happy to hear both of y'all talking about social media and having students examine that. One of my favorite ways to accomplish this course goal, especially when I'm actually teaching 2001, is to ask students to compose a paper where they are synthesizing scholarly or professional sources that they would have found through the databases with extremely informal sources, something like a comment on a Facebook thread or a comment below a YouTube video or in Reddit, and watching them kind of negotiate the different discourse practices of those two different communities it makes the papers really fun for me to read. And I think it provides the students a chance to sort of recognize that there is important communication happening in those different places, just for different reasons and with different audiences.
Thanks. Goal 3, students must exhibit increasing understanding that writing is a process. I'll just let you go from there. I don't think we need to look at the bullets. So how is writing a process in your class? What kind of work gets done, Ben?
We're doing brainstorming, journaling. Students are encouraged to revise papers. Students are kind of revising throughout the process. Students are doing peer review. There are some assignments where there's a good bit of collaboration in the invention stages of the writing process early on. And then there are some units where I incorporate more collaboration later on. And then I also do writing reflections, or more commonly now I do video reflections at the end of each unit, where students are creating a screencast recording, showing their papers or their compositions and talking about their writing and reflecting on it as the last stage of that process.
So can you say more about what platform are you using? Estimated, is there a prompts for this reflecting? How long is a video? I guess I probably can't ask, are you really watching all those, Ben?
That's a good question. In some cases, no, usually I'll say 3 to 7 minutes for the individual project reflections, but so I'll usually watch I always watch the first one that a student does for their first project, and provide, some more specific feedback on that in order to sort of make sure that they're meeting the expectations and communicate with them about, how they'll be doing that sort of thing for the remainder of the semester. But ultimately, like, that's an example of a composition that I think is primarily for the student. And there is some writing like that, including forum posts and whatnot, where I don't read every word that a student composes, and I think it's a mistake to feel like we should.
Right.
Yeah.
Kelly?
No, I agree with everything that Ben said. I give my students options to do video reflections. Most just end up writing it, but a couple end up doing the video. But yeah, all of those things.
I think I would say I'm model how writing is a process a lot. So there's a little bit of writing with the students, a little bit of showing my struggles, how it can be, writing can be really hard and tricky for me. And that's part of what writing is, especially if you're going back to students are really probably used to one-shot writing assignments where they write it, they get the grade, it's over. A lot of writing test prep, the writing test is timed, it's over. And I think part of that is just the system that public school teachers often find themselves in, to one degree. And then I would say that I scaffold a process. Like, a lot of the assignments lead to the next assignment. So we made what we call activity triangles, analyzing discourses. And then the next day we're writing and saying more about our triangles, and that ends up working into a bigger project and then I try to point out, and these are things that you could do even if your professor doesn't do them for you later. Like, you see how we're breaking this big job into these little part kind of things. Mm-hmm. And I guess the last thing I'll say that you guys said a little, so with reflecting, and I think out of the classroom, people tend to make fun of my reflective nature. The fact that almost everything I ever do, I'm thinking, how did that go? Could have I done anything different? What will I do next time? How do I prepare? So that's sort of my habit. Probably some of it is why I chose the profession I chose. Probably some of it has been accentuated because of what I do, right? But we do that in the classroom constantly. We're reflecting on the workshop. How did it go? Was it helpful? What are you thinking about now that you didn't think? So we embed that in what we do, including like a reflective letter on a portfolio.
Yeah, I think it just helps students to slow down, and to take some time to pause. And also it blurs that line of the assignment being done. And I'm always trying to emphasize to the students that no assignment, no major project in this class is done, until the very end. If you want to keep working on it, keep working on it. I'm happy to help you do it.
So last goal of 1000. Students must gain increasing ability to research and write in various environments, including electronic environments. I think we've heard some of that already. Ben, what would you add to that?
Well, in 1000, I make my students do a deep dive into Google Docs. That is a big technology. And it may seem like a minor point, but because we're a Google affiliated university, I have many students tell me by the end of the semester they're utilizing that technology for all of their other classes as well. I do the library databases. Like you said, I tend to focus a good bit on advanced search tools. I find that students don't just not know where to go, but they don't know how to go about searching. And I show them how I got my job at App State 7 years ago using an advanced Boolean operator search terms that I had created. So I show them how I search for certain things every week related to the soccer teams that I follow, and how, like, hey, these search mechanisms are things that can apply beyond, your college classrooms.
Nice. Kelly?
I think one thing I would add to that is that I've started to, in my 1000, or in both classes actually, really started to incorporate source management, because I realized that I was teaching them how to locate the sources. And then, okay, this is what we're going to do with the sources. And there was this area in between, like source management, that I realized that they were just keeping the little tabs up on their computer, which is great. Like I have a ton of tabs up on my computer too, but okay, just because, again, the act of reading has changed for us, we're reading digitally. And, I tell them about, hey, when I used to do research, I found these sources, I printed them all out, I sat at my desk and they were all in front of me, and I could sort of clump them over here and clump them over there. And it was a visual thing, but we don't have that necessarily now. So, in addition to just, the Google Docs and whatnot, and I don't, use any fancy system like Zotero or anything like that, but even just creating a research matrix document for them to input their information on, for them to see it in one place. And I guess this goes to reading and research. I've started to try to fill in that gap that I was seeing between finding the source and using the source.
Ben, you do some of that too? I feel like I've had some of your students who said, Professor Good had me do this.
Yes, yeah, I do some of that as well. I that Kelly was describing, and I'd also just like to share that I'm always trying to learn what I can from my students about how they go about doing individual research too. So one thing, and I teach my students that there's no right way to do it. Same sort of thing with the writing process. Some people like to create outlines, whatnot. So like I show my students things that I like to do. Like I like to use Weava, which is a Google add-on that allows you to highlight internet pages and saves those, and I have an elaborate bookmarking system set up, where it's like teaching resources, RC1000 subfolder, stuff like that. And so I'm always using the language of like choices with my students. Like, hey, I see one of my tasks is trying to give you as many different choices for you to go about finding success and sort of value in your own writing process. And that would be true, I guess, in how I'm having them do research.
I like that phrase, resource management. I might start using that. Kelly, did you coin the phrase resource management? How did you come up with that?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, so Ben, you were talking about, and I have glimpsed at your Google Drive system, which is pretty elaborate, I would say. And I also, we use Docs, and I just, finished 20% of my students messing up their permission settings in Google Docs, which is all these extra emails and so forth. Or that they share specifically with me, so I get 47 notifications when students make their annotated bibliography. Yeah. So, students come to my class probably with the definition for literacy, which means I'm able to read and write. So we expand that idea of what it means to be literate. And so both of you, Ben's Google mentioning that specifically, just their digital literacy skills, their literacy skills when it comes to using Google expand, and that's something they get from your class. And even we talk about, like, I think I'm a pretty savvy Twitter user, which I've used for lots of professional purposes that I gained from. Pretty savvy Facebook art user, especially like just targeting ads to people who might be interested in book projects I have or so forth, but completely Snapchat illiterate, right? Like when I can't begin to know. I mean, I had the app once, I think I deleted it, so there is an account out there for me. So it's so interesting that like you could be really good at Twitter but have no literacy in Snapchat. And so that's kind of something that we're talking about, which is true of their major, which is true of a job that they might get someday. And then I'll add that, I mean, when I did 1,000, I had students make video essays. So to me, like this various environments, including electronic environments, that would be where I would say, we're doing some film editing, we're combining voice, written text, images, video, and then I use the phrase, we draft in Google Docs, we publish to what we call a portfolio, which is a digitation platform, which is essentially a student's website. So we think of that we don't have process portfolios. I wouldn't say we publish to a website using images and chunking text and using hyperlinks and embedding video. So that would be, I think, what I would latch onto on goal 4. And then do we think maybe this is a moment to pause to each of you as course coordinators and say, from what you see, do you feel like our staff, are we on the same page? We're on all kinds of pages. What would you say about that, Ben?
I think we're mostly on the same page. In terms of what we're doing in 1000 and how it fits into the vertical writing model and how it differs from 2001, I think there's some overlap. And maybe I'm jumping ahead to a
That's
future
okay.
question
That's the
you're
way
going
it
to pose,
works.
but I do think there's some redundancy, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think that most people view RC 1000 as an introductory course to college or academic writing. Yeah, I think that's the common ground, I guess.
Yeah.
As troublesome as that term is, as we discussed.
Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, Ben would probably know more than I would about RC 1000, but I would venture to say that that everybody's probably on a similar page in terms of RC 1000. In terms of RC 2001, that may not be the case.
Yeah, I sort of, and knowing people like smile and chuckle and nod their heads at me, but don't tell me any stories. I sort of sense like that there are these rifts or gaps in belief or fights over turf on some of the things we've talked about teaching writing. But so far, I'm maybe 10 conversations deep into this topic and 1000 and 2001 and the vertical writing model. And I'm really seeing a lot of administrators and teachers who are on the same page. And it makes me wonder, like, what's everybody fighting about? If you're fighting, what are you fighting about? Which maybe, we'll get unpacked for me later. All right, so we're moving into 2001. The first goal, there's 5 goals, but really there's only 4 new ones, just like 1000. The first goal is pretty much like the students are going to be able to do all these things they did in 1000. They're demonstrating that, which is maybe tricky because maybe a few students didn't take 1000, but we'll jump into 2. RC 2001 students must exhibit increasing disciplinary awareness, reading and analyzing text from various genres, using rhetorical theory as a lens for understanding and evaluating text, developing burgeoning understanding of the genres and formats to their major disciplines. So Kelly, this goal number 2, what do you got?
I mean, it's all about research for me, because I do allow my students to focus on whatever their major is. There isn't just one way to teach RC 2001, but the way I approach it is to say, if I have a psychology major, a nursing major, a biology major, okay, let's do some research. Let's figure out what's going on in your fields, because I, as a faculty member, don't know everything that's going on in every single discipline across campus. And so I allow them there's a lot of exploration into academic journals from their fields, into professional organizations from their fields, and any other resources that those are the 2 that I really get them to focus on. So they really get a feel for what's happening. And I'm adamant about that exploration because I think students, maybe they're a business major, maybe they're a whatever, and they think they know what's going on in their fields at this point when they're, in their second year, but they don't necessarily. So I'm really that's a non-negotiable for me, is you have to explore first to see what's happening. And in terms of sort of evaluating texts, one of the assignments that I do, which is sort of attached to the translation assignment that we just talked about, is they locate a scholarly article and they annotate it. They don't write a paper on it, analyzing it or anything like that. The analysis comes through the annotations. And they use, I get them to use a structure language reference framework that originally came from an Insider's Guide to Academic Writing. But it's really just a way for them to analyze that text and then hopefully analyze any text that they encounter, after that. And they end up learning a lot about sort of the value system in their discourse community.
And
yeah, I would just add that I do a lot of what Kelly described, and I also have students analyze keywords in their fields as well. And that gets us focused in on some more specific language and discourse practices beyond just maybe genre conventions and stuff like that. And I will say, I find teaching 2001 challenging, particularly when I have students who are maybe math majors, or there's certain disciplines where you really have to kind of, I found I had to do a good bit of legwork to help students figure out how to go about doing the work.
yeah, the first thing I want to point out is that we kind of covered this at the open of our conversation, just in like, as students move through classes at App State, that they know that what good writing is and the way that they're supposed to work with sources is going to vary according to their major and who's the teacher. So to me, that's like the first most elementary disciplinary awareness idea. I really hammer away at the idea of genre to medium success, I think. Even like we were talking yesterday, and this comes from a text that we read, but when I got married, I didn't have to brainstorm and figure out how I was going to alert everyone to the fact that I was getting married and this is where they should come and that we had a reception, because so many people have done that before me that the genre of wedding invitation exists. And that our majors have these genres too, and probably when we get a job. And so we sort of started out on that. Almost all the students know what I'm talking about when I talk about TikTok or a tweet or a snap. So those are genres. But then I really, as Ben said, even to the point where I was like, I'm not sure this is what I should be doing. So we did genre analysis. We used activity theory, which points to things like tools, goals, audience, division of labor. So that activity theory has you look at those things, and we use that to evaluate texts. But so for example, I was trying to come up with a genre, a text that healthcare managers use. What's a genre common to healthcare managers? And I looked at the writing about guidelines on the WAC writing across curriculum page, which didn't, maybe there were some things there that I couldn't find online. I just could not find one. And so then I have a former student who's on the coaching staff that we're talking, and I was like asking him, and at first I've got to help him understand what I mean when I say genre, which is tricky. So I almost felt like that I'm jumping way ahead here, but we have writing in the discipline classes. I felt like I was out of my turf there a little bit when I was trying to tackle analyzing genres in your major. We'll let Kelly go. I mean, I know you're trying to do that too. What would you say about that?
Well, and one of the things that I thought about when you were speaking was the fact that there's a difference between the professional genres and the genres that they may write in as a major in that field, right? So, and there's a distinction, like some WID and capstone courses, in WID, writing in the disciplines, that they're going to get that as juniors, and then the capstone as seniors. In some of those classes, they do use professional genres. But then there are also just kind of like the classic academic genres as well, that fall into that. So the line is blurred sometimes when you're talking about genre in their different fields. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I get them to look at, scholarly articles and professional organizations to sort of see what's going on there, and they can see the difference in what's being presented. So yeah, and a lot of times you do feel like you're out of, like we are not experts on every single field. But my big thing with 2001 is getting them to be able to look at a text and figure things out from there, figure out what's going on, figure out how things are written. And I think what in the C's guidelines, I was reading about sort of genres evolving, and also about the writer, the need for the writer to be flexible. And I think that that's a big focus of my 2001 class.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
No, you go ahead, Bill.
The and you may, I may be moving on and you don't want to move on yet. Also under that umbrella of goal number 3 is correct use of 2 documentation styles. So, we'll start with Ben, if you had something you wanted to add to what Kelly said, and then moving into like, do you try and tackle this 2 documentation style goal?
Yes. I'll go real quick, Kelly. So yeah, I do both. Well, I do both APA and MLA in my RC2. Everyone has to write in those 2 styles, but when students are exploring their own individual fields, they may be discussing and taking notes on a different citation style, like Chicago or whatever it may be. And the last point I was going to make, and this kind of harkens back to what I was going to say a second ago, is then students sort of share those findings. It's not just something that I see as the instructor, because to me, a big goal in 2001 is for students to learn about the differences in writing across the curriculum. And that's sort of how I see that happening.
Yep. Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. And I would say that, in terms of the 2 documentation styles, I do hit on MLA early in the semester for 2001 for one of the projects, but largely I ask them to focus on the documentation style that they're going to use in their field. And so I will have students doing, IEEE, AMA, ASA, CSE, APA, all the things. And just because I think that's going to be really valuable for them moving forward, right? It kind of complicates like the sustainable development measures are kind of complicated, because the interdisciplinary measures are complicated. I just kind of tell them like, yeah, you're going to need to learn how to, mix it up and change courses.
So does that mean they turn in a writing assignment in the format? Is that what that looks like? And how do you prepare them to do that? Or so the first thing that I'm struck by is I would have no way of I wouldn't know how to give feedback, or
yeah,
I would suddenly have to learn more formats than I know, and maybe that's my job. So is that what Kelly, you feel like you know enough about each citation format to give helpful feedback?
I know enough about is my CSE perfect? Is my IEEE perfect? No, absolutely not. But I've actually created a treasure trove of documentation resources for my students, and that's what they use. And so I know enough about it just to know, number one, is everything formatted pretty much according to how it's supposed to be. And for the most part, so many students have to APA is super popular. Sure. Just around campus, but I have a couple of outliers from really sort of from certain majors who have to do like IEEE, for example, for engineering, but I know enough to guide them to be like, okay, you're on the right track. You know the value system of your discourse community moving forward, because their literature review has to be in this whatever documentation style they're going to be using. So yeah, I know enough. If there's a period or a comma missing or something like that, do I catch it? No. But like I said, they know that they're dipping their toe in at this point.
Do they Google that? Do they ask a professor in their field? How do you think they find the answer how do you think they decide that?
Largely, it's on how do they determine which documentation style they're going to use?
I'm just learning there's a thing called IEEE, I think is what you said.
Largely, it's on if you look at the writing about guides, there's a section at the very bottom that says documentation style. And that said, there are some fields that they may use Chicago, they may use APA, and then you have to ask, okay, if you're doing Chicago, are you doing author date style, or are you doing the notes version? And then we have a conversation about like, okay, if you're a history major, you're going to use the notes style more so because that's, what they need.
I like that a lot. I think a step in that direction for me would just be some sort of report exploration, like go out and see what you can find out about documentation in your major. I like that. I was just telling myself this morning that my first thought was that I make a mess out of documentation. And then I tried to tell myself that maybe that's okay. So I'll tell you how I make a mess out of it. I mean, a couple simple things that we do are we do an annotated bibliography in MLA, and then we change the format to APA, which is pretty easy. And we do that mostly from some clicking and copying and pasting and changing format from the databases at the library. So it's if I'm finding articles in the App State Library database, it's very easy to create a bibliography if we know where to click, which almost no one does as they arrive. And then we do a lot of like as we get ready to write our discourse report, we have lines from each of the articles that we think are going to be useful to us in our writing. And we note that these articles that we have read are in different formats themselves. And then we practice like integrating some of those quotes into what might turn out to be paragraphs we use in our report in MLA and APA. But what I find is then that in their reports, they have a mixture of both all through the report. Like it's like, they have a works cited page and they're using APA to introduce all of their quotes. It doesn't matter if I highlight that 3 class periods in a row and it's in the instructions. It's not like I'm saying this once. I'm like hammering this and they just miss it. And so these papers are messier than if I just tackled one. And then I've told myself that's okay that they're messy. So I wonder how you guys would feel about what I do. We just heard what Kelly does, which to me is like, super ambitious, and Kelly's smart. She knows she's more literate in the field of documentation styles than I am. Ben, what would you say about that?
I feel the same way, and that Kelly is much more literate. I also just learned about a couple new citation styles myself. I liked the language that Kelly used about getting students to kind of dip their toes into new citation styles. I do tend to emphasize APA more in my RC 2001 course. I also have an open discussion with students and say, this is not personally my primary concern when I am reading your writing. Because I find that many students come in with deep anxiety about like grammar mechanics, and one of those things as well is formatting. And they want to comment on it in each other's papers and stuff. And so I'm not saying this stuff doesn't matter at all. I'm just saying like I worry about students or maybe faculty placing so much emphasis on those aspects of writing, especially in a course where that is a goal, an outcome, is formatting like that, and citation styles, that it then maybe shifts some needed focus away from the development of ideas, the organization of them, and so on.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that whenever we discuss documentation in 1000 and 2001, we don't necessarily only discuss, like, yes, it is a way to cite your sources, right? But it's also a writing style. In terms of MLA, for example, they value quotations, and there's a reason they value quotations. But in APA, they value paraphrasing and summarizing more so. So it's more clear and concise and to the point. They're like, you use headings, so you don't need any flowery transitions from paragraph to paragraph. So we talk about it being a whole writing style. And it kind of makes more sense to students that way. And even in 2001, when they're, doing all different sorts of writing styles, they, kind of going back to the project that they do, the annotation project for me, looking for structure, language, reference. Like they look for things like passive versus active voice and hedging terms, and like they get into the minutia of how it's written. So hopefully later on, when they're working within their documentation style from their field, they can kind of emulate that writing style in their literature review. If that makes
that makes a lot of sense to me. I do something similar with APA and MLA with paraphrasing and quoting and understanding like why these genre conventions exist. And I just want to say real quickly that I always tell students that it's one thing to be knowledgeable in your field of study, but it's another thing to be able to communicate as if you have knowledge about how people should communicate in that field of study. And I always sort of use the reference that like there's lots of people out in the world who don't know what the heck they're talking about, but they're really good at making it seem like they do, you know. And unfortunately, there's lots of people who have lots and lots of disciplinary or specialized knowledge, but don't quite have the discourse practices or know how to communicate in a way that's expected of someone who does know what they're talking about, you know. And so I try to sort of emphasize, like you were talking about, Kelly, like the context of why this stuff matters, because it signals to people like a sense of belonging in that discourse community, and it helps to understand those practices in context.
You guys help me. I'm gonna do a better job next week now. It's on the schedule. MLA and APA practice. There's 2 days of that. So this weekend I'm gonna come up with I'm gonna be a little bit better teacher next week because of you two. All right, 2 goals left. Can we make it?
Yeah.
Okay. Nobody's got class at 11:20, 11:30.
No.
Nope. Okay. Goal 4. RC 2001 students must develop metacognition of academic writing, reflecting on disciplinary differences across academic writing, reflecting on their own writing and its place within disciplinary conversations, which seems like what we just talked about a lot. But Kelly, would you add anything?
I would just say, in addition to the portfolio and other reflective writing that they do throughout the semester, that a group project that I've started doing, which kind of gets to Ben's point about like, the discoveries that they make in their fields are not just theirs and yours, that they share them with other people. And so they are doing a group project now. It's just kind of sort of a presentation of their findings from their discipline. And I actually piloted Bethany's RC 2001 last year. And so they focused on ethical issues in their field. And so that was really interesting to compare the value systems in their writing and in just like issues that come up in their field as well.
Yep. Ben?
What Kelly said.
Yeah, good. It's, I sort of start to go, and I can't think this quickly, but like, why do we need both of these? If we're both like, yeah, they're kind of the same. But one thing I would dig in on is the idea of a disciplinary conversation, which is super hard to get the students to understand. Just to be saying something into a field, not to mention it's so difficult to do this early in their academic career in the major. But it helps us like start to think about what is a lit review that like, this is what's been said so far. And this is how I'm adding something new to that. And that's what the writer's trying to do. Because there's that feeling of why can't I just start? But I think one of the ways that I bring this to life a little bit, so we read James Paul G about discourses, and I show him a picture of James Paul G, and I show him the video game book that I came across. This is how I first met his work. I can't remember what the title is now. I won't even get into that. And then we look at, like I mentioned, should writers use their own English? So we look at Ashante Young's Twitter account, right? Like, look, this is a human, this is a person, which they don't think of at all. They get us, it's textbooks and articles, and they just gloss over the name. And so these are kind of things that this writer's tweeting. And Stanley Fish, he sets up his whole argument against something that this other person in his field has said, and that these are all conversations. So just trying to like bring to life, even if you guys may or may not know this, there's a football player named Tua from the Dolphins who probably had a concussion last Sunday, who played last night, and who was taken off the field on the stretcher after hitting his head again. And that Twitter has a very lively conversation about that topic, and that's what's happening in these academic journals, even though it's sometimes being done in much more stiff language.
And so you're giving like real life examples of the Burkean parlor, right?
Oh, right.
It's like, okay, this conversation is happening without you, and you can check it out and you can jump in or you can not jump in. But it's that those are really good examples to use, I think.
And even as getting a long time ago, getting a master's degree, me just wanting to say what I had to say about teaching, and my advisors being like, no, Bill, you have to read this and look at this, and what you're saying is actually the same thing that he said 25 years ago. You should, so I remember being resistant to that as a very new graduate student. All right, last goal. Students must develop information literacy strategies and skills that transfer across the curriculum. Interesting bullet here underneath to me: selecting and using hardware, software, databases, and other technologies for researching, drafting, and sharing writing. What would you say, Kelly?
I mean, basically even though this isn't a goal for 1,000, basically the same thing that we said for 1,000, they use the databases. I would probably say in 2001, we do talk a little more about open access journals and sort of like, the like access to information for their different disciplines. And it's kind of funny that the business majors always say, oh, all my professional resources, everything's behind a paywall. I have to be a member. And I'm like, oh, fancy that. And a lot of other majors don't have that issue. So yeah, really, I would say, kind of the same thing. The library, the internet, we use Google Docs. They can choose what platform they use for their e-portfolio.
Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, in 2001, I usually place more emphasis on students using some of the disciplinary specific databases as opposed to the general ones. Mm-hmm. And also I have students use Google Scholar Metrics to pull up publications in their individual fields and see which publications have been cited the most as a means of determining which authors, which ideas, which journals are having the most influence on those current or recent conversations in those disciplines.
You guys are killing it. You're both unbelievable teachers. What do you make of this word hardware? Why is hardware in there?
Probably because the goals were written back in 2006.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder what my hardware choices, and I'm totally open to the fact that there's a great explanation for it that I just can't think of. I mean, because when I was trying to think, I was like, well, so in our discourse communities, we used to interview experts in the discourses, which sort of fell by the wayside during the pandemic, and I haven't brought it back yet, but I want to. Like, are we going to use a voice recorder? Am I going to get a mic for my laptop when I interview this? I mean, that was the only thing I could come up with on the hardware. When I get into software, we're using Digication to create a website. Other people are using different things, right? That might be a second to say, are you guys doing final portfolios? Where are they publishing those? Ben, are you doing final portfolios? Do they have a choice? How do they?
Yeah, my students do a final portfolio. They can use any platform they want to. They create a website that then is shared with me and with the entire class. And that website, for me at least, the most important component is the final reflection that they do. It's a portfolio where they're posting their final published compositions. It's not a process one.
What are some popular platforms? And Kelly and I I guess Kelly came in at the end of a conversation we were having. I guess that was in the Writing Across the Curriculum office, where I still use Digication portfolios. So certainly there could be a need on my part to decide what path I'm going to take. So what are some popular choices that the students use?
Wix, Google Sites, Adobe Spark, WordPress.
Yeah, and all that stuff's cool with you, and And are those things they're putting in their Google Drive folders? Is that how you get a hold of them?
I have them post a URL to a forum at the bottom of our As You Learn site as the final assignment of the semester. The biggest challenge, as with a portfolio, is making sure that students publish their work.
Yeah.
Meaning it's you can't access the link.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So that happens. I do that throughout the semester. So they usually they know what they're doing by the end.
Yeah.
Kelly, how about you? Final portfolio platforms.
Yeah, I also give students a choice. I used to use a portfolio exclusively, and I started opening up to just give students choices. And, a lot of students do still choose to use a portfolio because there is support for that on campus, because I realize they're at different levels of, their technological, knowledge. But some students do choose to use Google Sites, Wix. I've had some use Canva as well.
Right.
And yeah, I don't have any problems with it. Yeah, there are always a few, but there were a few with a portfolio as well where you don't have access to certain pages. So I always tell students to be on alert and check their emails at the end of the semester. But like you said, Bill, like we work on them throughout the term. So hopefully if there are any issues, I can catch it before the very end.
You guys remind me that another, I think, important thing that we do in my course is expand the definition of what it means to write. So for them, writing is like a paper they print out and hand to me, or it's a Google Doc that they turn into a learning management system. And so I'm considering, a YouTube video, a form of text, or we're embedding videos and using hyperlinks and images. Would you agree with that? You do the same kind of stuff? Kelly?
Yeah, because when we talk about like them curating their portfolio, I sort of I phrase it that way. Like, you are going to curate a portfolio. You are going to, like, I'm going to have requirements and you're going to decide some other things to put in there. This portfolio will reflect your, personality. And I always tell students that if your personality is not rainbows and puppy dogs and kittens, I don't want to see rainbows and puppy dogs and kittens on here. But if it is, great, knock yourself out, make it yours. So they have freedom to make those rhetorical decisions in how they compose, the layout.
Right. Yeah. And I've started adding more requirements for students to integrate or embed videos or images or hyperlinks even into papers, especially in RC 1000. So they start to get a better understanding of that composing multimedia compositions that then I think finds its way into the final portfolio too.
Yeah. Great, guys. We made it through all of the objectives in both courses. And I was super interested. So thanks so much for doing that with me.
Sure. Thank you, Bill.
Smart takes the shot, and the Hoosiers with 3 seconds. Go ahead.
But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain and an athlete
and a basket case, a princess,
and a criminal. Does that answer your question?
I love you guys.